Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their monthly donations help make Backyard Ecology possible. If you would like to join them, please visit my Patreon page. Also, if you would like more Backyard Ecology, please check out my blog and YouTube channel. There's a lot going on every week in the Backyard Ecology world. To make sure you don't miss out on any of it, I offer a free weekly Backyard Ecology email. I'll have links in the show notes for the Backyard Ecology Patreon page, blog, YouTube channel, and email list. Did you know that Venus flytraps are native to a very small part of eastern North and South Carolina, and that that's the only place in the entire world that they grow naturally, or that they are insect pollinated, or that they rarely eat flies? I didn't either until I stumbled upon a research paper talking about the pollination of Venus flytraps. That paper led me down a rabbit hole of questions and fascinating discoveries about a plant that I had always been intrigued by, but had never taken the time to really learn about. I'm guessing I'm not the only one who is intrigued by these little plants, but doesn't necessarily know a whole lot about them. That's why I asked Laurie Hamon to join us for this episode of the Backyard Ecology podcast. Laurie is an entomologist who recently completed her dissertation at North Carolina State University, studying Venus flytraps and their pollination. She is also the author of the paper that I stumbled upon, and which sent me on my own quest to learn more about Venus flytraps. Hi, Laurie. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, Shannon. Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, you're welcome. And I am really looking forward to this conversation because other than the obvious carnivorous habits of Venus flytraps, I really don't know a whole lot about them. And then while I was preparing for this episode, I realized that a lot of what I just kind of assumed to be true about them wasn't. And I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners may hold similar misconceptions. And I can't wait to learn more myself because Venus flytraps are just so cool. I've always thought that, but never really dug deeper. And now I get to dig deeper with somebody that knows a bit about them.
Yeah, they're absolutely fascinating plants. And as you mentioned, they're quite misunderstood. I'd say something that a lot of people don't know is that they only occur in a very small part of the world, which might be close to home for some of your listeners. They only occur in Southeast North Carolina and Northeast South Carolina, at least naturally. So they occur in a very small region there, endemic, meaning they only occur, within a narrow sort of range.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I didn't realize. I mean, just because they're so exotic and bizarre looking, I always kind of assumed that they had to be native to somewhere far, far away, probably the tropics if I took time to think that hard about them, but it was just like, not here. And the idea that they're not that far away from where I'm at, and even closer to where my mother and some of my family grew up at, and very much here in the Eastern US was just like mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I mean, it goes even further than that. Here in the South, where I'm at in the Southeast US, I'm talking to you from North Carolina, we're sort of an epicenter of carnivorous plant diversity. So we have pitcher plants, sundews, bladderworts, other carnivorous plants. In North Carolina alone, we have some 30 odd species. So there's quite a few.
Wow, that's fascinating because like I said, I never really thought about it. I mean, of course I was intrigued and interested and always have been. I mean, how can you not be about a plant that eats bugs? Right. But then to take it that step further, I never did it to learn. And now this is going to be so much fun. If you can't tell, and as my listeners already know, I'm a total nature nerd and nature geek. So I'll go down these rabbit holes and just like, oh, cool, and want to learn too.
Absolutely. I mean, carnivorous plants are such an accessible avenue to get people into nature because it sort of flips the script on its head. It's a plant that eats bugs. So yeah, they're massively interesting. They're also sort of rare, so they're a sort of conservation story as well. And I'm specifically been studying the pollination, so they interact with insects not only as predator-prey, but also, like many other flowering plants, as pollinator and flower.
Yes, and that's something that we really want to talk about as well. But before we get into that stuff, because I mean, yeah, there's a million different directions we can go, and I'm sure we will go with this.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in Venus flytraps going beyond just the, oh, cool, that's interesting. They eat insects, but getting into that, I wanted to learn more and study them more.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know I was going to end up studying Venus flytrap specifically. I was a bug plant interaction person, and I spoke to my prospective advisors. So I just graduated. I spoke to my prospective advisors here at North Carolina State University, Becky Irwin and Clyde Sorensen, and they've been studying the pollinators of Venus flytrap, literally who pollinated it. Led by another person, Elsa Youngstead, and some other collaborating scientists before 2018 or 2017, no one actually knew what was the pollinator of Venus flytrap. No one had ever sort of written it down. So this team, before I started, had gotten into, okay, who's actually visiting Venus flytrap? And when I was brought on, I was interested in questions about, okay, so now we know who pollinates them. How important is pollination for reproduction in this rare species? Who are the most efficient pollinators and other aspects of its reproductive biology like that? So getting into some of that nitty gritty.
Yes, which I mean, that's really what led me to you and just wanting to totally geek out and learn more about Venus flytraps. Is not too long ago, I was looking for a paper. I don't even remember what I was looking for
Mm-hmm.
at this point, but I stumbled upon a research paper that you've published recently about pollination of Venus flytraps. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I've never thought about that before. And as soon as I saw the words insect pollinated, my mind was just totally blown. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? How does that work? You can't eat your pollinators. That's kind of counterproductive. And of course, I had to read the paper and then totally geek out and learn more. So, yeah, this is like fascinating to me.
Yeah, it come to us a surprise to a lot of people that pretty much all our carnivorous plants in the world. So there's over 600 species of carnivorous plants, and it's evolved independently, essentially meaning a bunch of plants had the same idea at the same time or at different times across the world and sort of convergently evolved to eat bugs. Most of our carnivorous plants are also flowering plants. So they're producing a flower, they're trying to attract insects, and there's an ongoing debate or area of study as to whether or not they eat their pollinators, or is it a big issue if you eat your pollinators, etc. So yeah, we're sort of at the leading edge of trying to figure out that sort of interaction.
Yeah, which is also really surprising when you stop to think about it. I mean, people have known about Venus flytraps for ever, really.
Mhm.
And we're just now figuring out or thinking about the pollination interactions with them.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And so, yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, mostly when people think about the plant, they think about the sinister looking mouths sort of near the ground level, but a lot of people haven't even seen what the flower looks like. So the flower is produced on a stalk about 1/2 foot to 1.5 foot above the traps themselves. And they're about sort of 8 to 12 white flowers, which on its own, some people have said is quite understated, but I think when you see thousands of them blooming at once, they're really brilliant. And they're popular with a bunch of different insects. So they're visited by a generalist suite of insects, mainly little green sweat bees, other bees, a number of different beetles, longhorn beetles, scarab beetles. So a lot of things are visiting this plant. So it's important beyond just the fact that it eats bugs, but that it's providing pollen and nectar to bugs as well.
Right. Yes. And I guess being so far above the part that eats the leaves that are modified to eat or digest the insects helps
Mhm.
with the not eating your pollinators portion of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're suspended quite a ways above the actual traps themselves, and they're sort of back and forth as to whether that's an adaptation to minimize eating their own pollinators. The alternative thinking is that if you're a flowering plant, it's often a good idea to have your flowers up high and in the path of flying pollinators. So we're not quite certain to what degree that difference in height between the flowers and the traps is the flytrap essentially trying not to eat its own friends. But it certainly seems to help because there's very little overlap in who's getting caught in the traps and who's visiting the flowers.
And I guess it doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive thing either. I mean, it could just be a happy accident, basically, that it does both.
Yeah, absolutely. Both could very much be true.
But yeah, so we might want to kind of step back just a little bit here and go back to a little bit of the basics. So we said that they're only found, Venus flytraps, they're only found in that eastern part of basically the border between North and South Carolina.
Yeah.
So very endemic to a very small region of the world, only found there.
Mm-hmm.
But what kind of habitats are they found in?
So they occur largely in high light, nitrogen poor environments, chiefly longleaf pine savannas. So savanna-like environments, especially grading into what we call pocosin, which is basically kind of a wet shrub bog. So they love the interface between these drier open savannas and these sort of wetter, boggier parts. But also they're found in like power lines where it can get a little bit wet or boggier, sometimes in roadside ditches where it happens to interface with these pine savannas. So they occur in a number of habitats, but they like their feet wet and they like lots of light.
Okay. And how long do they live? Do we know?
We don't know how long wild plants live, but it's presumably long-lived because those that are occurring in horticulture are supposedly live 15 to 20 years. So yeah, they're long-lived. I've followed individuals at least over the 5 years that I've been doing my PhD. So yeah, they're considered long-lived perennials.
Wow. But then a lot of our savanna plants and perennial plants like that are longer lived. So I can see it happening, but you often think of a plant as living that long, even though they do oftentimes.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, they can be very long-lived, even, the short, herby, scrubby things that we might not necessarily think of having this long history. But as you mentioned, Venus flytrap co-occurs with tons of other savanna plants in an environment that is most often maintained by frequent disturbance, specifically fire. So it co-occurs with orchids, other carnivorous plants that I've mentioned, a lot of interesting things. So I love looking at Venus flytrap in its natural habitat, and like there's so much to look at out there. It's a little center of biodiversity that's not very far from where I live.
And do you usually find them kind of like scattered individuals throughout, or do you find larger patches, or how do they grow?
I mean, that's a great question. Sometimes they can occur almost in sort of mats where there's many individuals, hundreds of individuals occurring in a pretty narrow space. And sometimes they'll be in a field, sort of almost like a really significant portion of the understory, like scattered throughout a field, which is where it becomes impressive when a bunch of them are blooming at once. But then, of course, sometimes they are more scattered. So there are a handful of really, really good flytrap populations where you go out and there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. But most of the populations that we have are just handfuls of them. So it really varies in like their growth habit.
And I'm guessing, and I may be wrong here, but if a lot of the areas where they're found are still in those smaller patches, and then also knowing what I know about fire suppression and stuff like that, that we may be getting kind of a blurred picture of what they would naturally grow in just because they don't have necessarily the opportunity and sometimes to spread out more, become those larger patches. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that might be one way of looking at it, but we have, so there's about 880,000 individuals of flytrap growing in North and South Carolina. About over 90% of the individuals we have are occurring in just a handful, like 3 or 4 of these good populations, and we consider those to be, you know, emblematic of perhaps the kind of environment they thrive in because they're occurring, you know, by the thousands. But then in areas, the concern for where there are those smaller populations is that it's harder to burn those spots. The resources aren't available for people to burn those spots. Perhaps there's other factors that are involved. So those smaller populations are at higher risk of essentially blinking out compared to these much larger strongholds for the species.
But we've got big enough patches, at least a few big enough patches, that we can get a pretty good idea for what they would be like on larger scales even.
Yeah, and though the range was a little bit larger, we used to have 140 populations. Now we have about 74 extant populations. So over 60 have been extirpated or removed from the environment. But beyond that, Venus flytraps apparently have only ever existed in this pocket of North and South Carolina, so they seem to like it here. So, yeah.
And do you want to share with our listeners how we know that they only ever exist in that little pocket? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that, or the importance of the herbarium specimens and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Herbarium specimens are a major resource for understanding the historical and current ranges of our plant species. At least Europeans specifically have known about Venus flytrap since the 18th century. So that's when our herbarium specimens started. And so yeah, I mean, writings and herbarium specimens from history are the main way that we know that it seems to have only existed in this little pocket.
Yeah. Which is always interesting because we sometimes forget about the importance of those early historical writings, and then also the importance of herbarium specimens or any museum, natural history museum specimens like that, being able to have that record 200 years long where you can go back and look at and see, okay, this is where it used to be found, and kind of draw that map. And then when you get into the oral histories and knowledge of the indigenous people, and trying to trace it back even further than that, I mean, there's so many things that we forget about sometimes, and we silo ourselves when we're doing research, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that the Venus flytrap is an interesting case study because it's so charismatic. It means there's been relatively quite a few eyes on it over historical time. So it makes for a good case study of how the perception or writings about it have changed over time. So yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, you kind of mentioned or kind of touched on this a few minutes ago, but let's dig a little bit deeper. When we're talking about the pollination, and you mentioned that they're not always the same insects. So what do Venus flytraps eat? Because it's not flies. I realized that when I was doing the research, and I was like, wait a minute, what? No, you're just totally blowing my mind here.
Yeah, the word flytrap is somewhat of a misnomer. Flies make up a really tiny percentage of what they're actually catching in the wild. It's usually ground crawling insects and spiders. So ants make up a big portion. Spiders, like jumping spiders, make up a big portion of their diet, so to speak. So things that are sort of blundering along the ground that get into the traps, that's mostly what they're getting. But I mean, they can get flies. I've seen them get wasps. They can get all sorts of things, but yeah, the stereotypical footage of a Venus flytrap snapping on a fly that's in the wild, somewhat unusual.
And so, is there any sort of an attraction element to it, or is it just whatever blunders along?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there is some back and forth about that between people who study carnivorous plants as to what degree Venus flytrap and other plants rely on attractants. So there was a paper that came out in 2014. The author's first name I don't remember, but his name was Crossweiser. And he and his team essentially studied the smell of the Venus flytrap traps. I can attest that humans can't smell what the traps smell like, but they are producing a similar suite of smells that's similar to flowers and fruits that are potentially playing a role in attracting insects, which may have a factor in why why ants are blundering into there. Some people point to the red coloration as being a potential attractant, but there's a lot of debate about whether red is actually an important attractant or whether it's just a byproduct of some other aspect of the plant's, functioning, because for some carnivorous plants, red seems to play a role. For others, it seems to not mean much. For the record, insects aren't very good at distinguishing the color red, which is why some people are skeptical about it. Oh, and UV. So if you shine a UV light on Venus flytrap traps, like flowers often do, they display a pattern of UV reflectance that potentially plays a role as an attractant, but we're not sure to what degree that's true.
Interesting. And again, I've never seen them in the wild, but do they tend to lay more flat and open towards the ground so that'd be easier for things to just kind of bump along as they're walking along the ground, or are they more upright?
That's a great question. It really varies both across populations and also within the same individual. So some people have observed that during flowering or during the summer, the leaves or the traps tend to stand more upright, and what we would call the petioles or the stems leading up to the traps that are wide and flat and playing a role in photosynthesis, those tend to be thinner during the summer. So thin, upright is usually the summer growth form. And then in the early spring and fall, they tend to lay more flat. And that may have something to do with resource allocation, like maybe they have more, they're able to afford to have larger traps during the summer that stand upright and potentially catch larger prey compared to the fall and early spring, where the traps tend to be shorter, flatter, and have smaller traps. So, I mean, that's a great point. You would expect if that ground crawling things are the main prey items that they'd want them to be nice and flat all the time, but no, often they stand upright. So that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and my brain's going in 50 directions now with that, and as to why they would stand up and some of the times and lay down other. Yeah,
I mean, in addition to the fact that they catch insects, they're also, they're green plants, they're photosynthesizing, so they're getting nutrients from the sun as well. So the degree to which they're balancing, getting efficient photosynthesis versus efficient prey capture is another thing that's an area of active study. Yeah, it's really interesting. Carnivorous plants are often not terribly efficient at photosynthesizing. They seem to sacrifice some aspect of that efficiency when they become carnivorous. So there's some trade-offs happening there, which are interesting to think about.
yes. And it's interesting that we're just now really starting to study and research that, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, my mind just immediately starts going into hypothesis mode and, ooh, would it be this? Would it be that? And how would you figure that out?
Yeah, it's fascinating. But when you consider that it was controversial, the notion that plants could even eat insects when these things were being described in the 18th century, we still have a long way to go into understanding sort of the mechanisms behind how these things have evolved and how they best thrive in the field. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yes. And the triggering methods are really interesting too, from what I was reading on there, and just how they even recognize, very anthropomorphic there, but how they get triggered to actually close up at some times and not at other times.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at a Venus flytrap trap, each of those lobes has 3 trigger hairs, sometimes more. I've seen them with 4. I've read that can have up to 6, but almost always 3 trigger hairs on each of those lobes. At room temperature, if one or several of those are touched twice within about 20 seconds, it'll snap shut, and then the prey has to continue to struggle in order for the plant to essentially commit to the notion that this is a living prey, and then it'll hermetically seal, and then digest over the course of about a week. Yeah, it's easy to anthropomorphize that because it's a very sort of something we associate with animals. And so many people in lab settings study specifically the physics, the chemistry behind Venus flytrap trapping and digestion. That's still a sort of field that we're sort of just tapping into. There's been hundreds of papers on it, but there's still a lot of back and forth about how it happens specifically. So yeah, it's very cool.
Yes. And I mean, that's the great thing about science is that we're always learning. You can never know everything, and there's always something more to dig deeper and learn more about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just love the fact too that, I mean, it's not just triggering it to close, but then it has to still be struggling inside there in order for it to produce those digestive juices. And like you said, kind of commit to it, because otherwise, yeah, I mean, what happens if at the last second it somehow scoots out? I mean,
Yeah.
and gets, then it would be doing that for nothing. And it does take energy to close and energy to produce those digestive juices. So it wouldn't make sense for it to do it for nothing and have nothing in there.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a degree of chemical signaling as well, like evidence that it's responding to actual chemicals being put out by the prey item in order to, quote unquote, make that decision to actually eat something. Yeah, when I do sort of outreach with actual outreach plants, I can understand and relate to kids wanting to put their fingers in the trap to trap them. But the unfortunate thing is I have to stop them because, yeah, it's an energy sink for the plant, and each trap can only do it a handful of times before it ceases to function. So there's sort of a limited number of times that it can actually do that trapping motion, especially committing to a prey takes a lot of resources. So all in all, it's a good idea to leave fly traps alone.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm a little kid at heart, and yes, I would want to, especially in a, maybe not in the wild setting, but in a more controlled educational setting, yes, I would be wanting to get them to trigger, because it'd just be cool to watch a million times. But
absolutely, yeah, I totally understand that.
I completely get it. But yeah, I do understand that I got to watch it because it is a resource sink for the plant. But you just said something that's got me curious there. You said they can only do it so many times. Is that so many times in a row, or do they only have, like, I don't know, I'm pulling numbers out there. They can only close 6 times, and then the trap kind of wilts and dies, and they have to produce a new one. How does that work?
Yeah, I don't have the specifics on sort of how many times or how frequent they need to trap before the trap essentially dies or withers or becomes purely a photosynthetic organ that's not catching anymore. Based on what I've read and what I can tell is that to some degree, as it's opening and closing, there's water being moved around, there's cell walls being moved around, and it sort of loses its elasticity over time, and it just loses the ability to actually do the snap that it needs to do. There's probably some more articulate papers out there that can tell it better than I do, but definitely after a single trap doesn't last an entire season. It traps a few times, it dies, the plant is continuously producing new traps during the growing season.
Wow. Yeah, that's something else I've never really thought about. It's a Venus flytrap. Of course, you have the trap up, and it's just there, and never really thought about, wait a minute, they can wear out, and just like leaves go away, why
Mhm.
wouldn't, I mean, it's a modified leaf structure,
Mhm.
really.
Yeah. The trap itself, if you think about, a stereotypical leaf in your head may be a maple leaf. The actual mapley part of the maple leaf is what corresponds to the trap. And then the stem leading up to the maple leaf is that heart-shaped lobe on the Venus flytrap, what we call the petiole, and the green part that's doing the heavy lifting in terms of photosynthesizing. So yeah, the traps themselves are modified leaves, as is the case with sundews, a closely related carnivorous plant that people may be familiar with from those sticky hairs that it has all over it. Those leaves, those are leaves as well. Pitcher plants are modified leaves. So yeah, they're plants.
Yeah. Which, I mean, honestly, and this may sound really stupid, but before I started really looking into Venus flytraps after I contacted you and just went, oh, wait a minute, I got to know more. They're more than just something that eats bugs. And started doing some research for this podcast. I honestly almost thought of the trap part as being the flower because it is the
Mm.
showy part and wasn't even thinking of it as a leaf until, well, insect pollination. And then I have to figure out, okay, wait a minute, that can't be the trap because that definitely wouldn't work. And then go into researching, oh, wait a minute, they do have pretty white flowers.
Yeah, I don't think that's stupid at all. I think it's natural to think of that showy part of the plant as being the flower. And it's, um, it's some people think of it as, being similar to a flower and that it's trying to attract insects. But yeah, I think that's a natural way to think. But I think a fun Google search for folks to do is to look up carnivorous plants that they know and then look up their corresponding flowers. Southeastern pitcher plants have some of the weirdest flowers. They look like upside down umbrellas. They're so bizarre. So flowers are an overlooked and I think equally fascinating part of carnivorous plant ecology.
Yes. And I mean, that's really goes with a lot of what first drew you to them was the pollination aspects with the interactions, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's an undertold story about this plant, but it's considered an at-risk species. It's currently a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And pollination is such an important part of reproduction. It seems like it's an important aspect to tell as part of the overall conservation story for any plant, carnivorous or otherwise. So I think a lot of people, it's not hard to get people interested in Venus flytraps, but it's fun to have this sort of underdog aspect of, well, let's talk about the flowers.
Yes. And I love it too, because I mean, with everything, you've got to have that connection before you can get interested and then want to dig deeper and learn more. And so for
Mhm.
many people, it's just that bizarre aspect of it eats insects.
Mhm.
And then for others, it's going to be the pollination. And then for me, one leads to the other. And I think for a lot of people, that's what happens. And now I'm like, oh, tell me more about this pollination and what's going on
Mhm.
there.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Do the flowers smell?
no, the flowers don't have, well, okay. I don't know if the flowers have a smell that bugs can smell. Humans cannot smell the flowers. And I tried to test what the flowers actually smell like. That ended up falling through, which means there's a big unanswered question is the smell of the flowers in any way similar to the smell of the traps? Because if they smell similar and the smell of the traps is playing a role in attracting prey, you could think that that's maybe a dilemma for the plant if it's using similar smells that the flowers and the traps. So that's a big unanswered question. So no, if you put your nose down to a Venus flytraps flower, you won't smell anything, but maybe the bugs are smelling something. We just don't know. Other carnivorous plant flowers have smells. Like yellow pitcher plant flowers are said to smell like cat urine, and they do. So yeah, so some of them do have smells.
Yes. And it's amazing how many flowers smell like urine or
Uh-huh.
feces
Yeah,
or other things like
or
that that we
carrion.
don't.
Yeah.
Yes. But this is
Yeah,
about being attractive to the insect pollinators, not to people.
exactly. And a major visitor for our yellow pitcher plant flowers are flesh flies. So they're not doing it for our benefit. They're doing it for the benefit of their pollinators.
Yes. So you said that they are candidate for listing. What are some
Mhm,
of the threats to them? I know we've kind of mentioned one,
mhm.
but what are some of the others?
Yeah, on top of fire suppression and sort of with suppressing fire is anything that destroys or modifies their ideal habitat. So development for agriculture or development, both residential and commercial, that's the big one. So fire suppression, land use change, those are the major ones. And to a lesser but still noteworthy degree, illegal collection in the wild is also considered a threat to the species. But the chief ones to watch out for are the fact that once the habitat's been modified or fire suppression has gone on for a long time, Venus flytrap is very sensitive to changes in water levels, in light accessibility, and it quickly disappears from the environment.
And with fire suppression, I mean, a big part of that is that the way I understand is that it's the allowing other vegetation to creep in and kind of shade out and crowd out the Venus
Yeah.
flytraps.
Yeah, so fire, as you probably already know, has a number of benefits, specifically in the pine savanna ecosystem. So it can help some plants promote germination, it can return some nutrients to the soil. But yes, as you say, the big one is preventing encroachment from taller plants that could potentially shade out Venus flytrap and other shorter, poorer light competitors. Venus flytrap hates shade. So anyone who's taller and who's nearby, shades it out.
Which is really, on one hand, kind of weird to think about that fire suppression is such a big deal because I think of Venus flytraps as being a moister area
Mm-hmm,
plant, kind of that boggier. And so then you've got that fire versus a wetter area. But
mm-hmm.
fire is still really important in those ecosystems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The wet factor and the fire factor are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I mentioned that some of the densest populations or areas of Venus flytrap are what we would call the ecotones, are basically the halfway points between drier, more open pine savannas and these shrubbier, boggier, the term we use is precocins. And when you think of a fire going through an ecosystem, the fire might persist in that pine savanna, really get through that entire savanna, and might get a little bit into that precocin, but will mostly be stopped by the moisture. So, I mean, the moisture on the landscape is affecting the degree to which the fire, like where it travels and how intense it is, and that plays a role in the kind of habitats that persist and where Venus flytrap is able to persist. So yeah, it likes places that are wet but still get burned.
Which, like I said, is just an interesting juxtaposition to
Mm-hmm.
think about. Now, with the fires that come through and clear the area out so that gets the vegetation away so the Venus flytraps can come up. I'm assuming, since we're talking an herbaceous plant here,
Mm-hmm.
that it at least top kills the vegetative portion of the Venus flytrap for that year. It's not like a fire adapted oak tree that has the corky bark, and once it gets the nice corky bark, the tree itself can survive through the fires. I'm assuming we're actually top killing at least the Venus flytrap. Does it also kill the root of it or just the vegetative part for that season?
No, an individual plant survives the fire. So at least in the pine savanna environment, the fire that's burned frequently, the fires tend to be quite cool for a fire, and also to penetrate the soil very shallowly, so that heat doesn't go particularly deep. So you're right, when a fire goes through, the part of the plant that's exposed to the air is killed off, is burned. But Venus flytrap exists as an underground rhizome, and quickly springs back. It doesn't even take a growing season. It's usually within about 2 to 3 weeks before the flytraps start coming back. They're very quick to spring back after a fire.
That's cool. And it makes sense that they would want to get or need to get back up again like that.
Yeah, and with the pollination specifically, other papers have found that not just for Venus flytrap, but including Venus flytrap, that fire can stimulate the percentage of plants that are able to flower during a given year. So it also promotes flowering as well.
Do we know if it's promoting flowering just by clearing out the vegetation and allowing more light, or is it something about the fire itself, whether that's the nutrients released by the ash or the heat that's causing it to actually promote the flowering?
Yeah, we don't know. That's an interesting question. The predominant thinking is that, yeah, more light, more photosynthesis, more nutrients that can go towards flowering. I've also heard speculation that a more open environment means perhaps you're catching insects easier. I don't know much how much weight there is to that theory, but it speaks to the fact that we're still sort of piecing out the interrelation between flowering and fire.
Yeah, there's always so many interesting things to think about, even down that route, whether it's with Venus flytraps or any other species that grows in these fire-dependent habitats.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my favorite things to introduce people to concerning Venus flytrap is that there's actually a moth species that specializes on eating Venus flytrap. And so this moth, the Venus flytrap cutworm moth, is extremely rare because the plant it eats is extremely rare. But unlike its plant, it dies during a fire. So it depends on having nearby populations to repopulate where a fire has occurred. So the fire management for plants versus insects can sometimes differ a little bit. So going forward, increasingly land managers are interested in taking into account not just burning for plants, but for everything in an ecosystem. So the flytrap is an interesting case study for that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was wondering about was, we think of them thinking of the Venus flytraps as, okay, they're carnivorous, they eat the insects. We're now learning that they're insect pollinated and all those cool things. So you got the nectar and the pollen that it's producing, but is there another role what other roles do they play? Like you said, the Venus flytrap cutworm moth eating the Venus flytrap. Is it specific to just Venus flytrap like monarchs are to milkweeds, or will the caterpillars host on other plants as well?
It's unclear since we've observed so few of them, but they've only ever been found in environments with flytrap. They've only ever been found feeding on flytrap in the wild. There's some thinking that they might switch to a different host plant as the larvae or caterpillars grow up. So it seems like they're dependent on Venus flytrap, but they might be able to switch to other things later. Regardless, they seem pretty specific to Venus flytrap, which is, it's wild, as you mentioned. Yeah, this plant has evolved to eat insects, and there's an insect that's evolved to eat this plant. And this insect isn't the only thing that eats Venus flytrap, though it seems to be the one that loves it the best. Sometimes it gets browsed on by grasshoppers or slugs or deer. So any given plant is interacting with its environment in myriad different ways. For Venus flytrap, it adds predator to the list, but again, it's a flower resource, it's a vegetable resource. It's interacting with the surrounding plants. So yeah, there's a whole story with any plant.
Yes. And yeah, that was one of the things I was curious about was, does other things eat it? And how do they keep from getting stuck and trap themselves? But I guess they just avoid that part. And mammals, deer and stuff, that would be easy. They're big enough, they could just pull away. But the insect predators makes it more interesting.
Yeah, and the one time decades ago that someone tested to see if the Venus flytrap cutworm can escape from the traps if it gets caught, the cutworm didn't escape from the trap. So they literally just avoid triggering the traps. They eat from the outside. They clip the stems up to the traps, those petioles. So yeah, it's bizarre. It seems like a really risky way to live, but I'm not judging them.
No, they're cool and interesting and something more to dig into because, yeah, so much fun there.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to fires real quick here.
Mm-hmm.
What would have been the natural sources of fire? I mean, now we have prescribed fires, controlled fires where we set them and try and manage for them. How would they have happened previously?
Yeah, before and upon European colonization, indigenous people were burning land for promoting game species. So some of the indigenous tribes that occur where Venus flytrap is include the Kori, the Lumbee, the Nusaic. A number of people occurred in that area. And then if we think back eons and eons and eons over geologic history, it's suspected that lightning strikes played a role in starting fires. And indeed, there was a major lightning strike fire in a Venus flytrap population this year, so they still occur. I mean, lightning hasn't stopped, but historically that was probably setting the disturbance pattern. So yeah, so indigenous people, European settlers continued to burn to some degree. And then it was at the time of Smokey the Bear and, and other policies where fire fell out of fashion. So only in the last 100 years or so that, fire suppression became a major factor. Relatively recent in terms of geologic history, have we started to actively suppress fire.
And in those Smokey the Bear years, which I grew up with Smokey the Bear, yeah, that ended up doing a lot of damage to a lot of ecosystems. It was a great idea with a good heart for the time and the issues that they were facing, but got applied a little bit too much and in the wrong, not in necessarily the right places all the time.
Yeah. And to be clear, there is value, at least for like campers, to
yes.
mind fire safety, especially because fire suppression has happened. So there's more fuel load in the forest itself. So fires tend to be more destructive when they do get out of hand. So people who are trained to do prescribed fires are the way to do it for now.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of common sense for Smokey the Bear too, and we still need them.
Yeah.
But fire is not bad. Fire in the wrong places and the wrong times is bad.
Right. But where Venus flytrap grows specifically, I think it's more frequent than people think. The usual fire return interval for a managed flytrap population is about every 3 to 4 years, so pretty frequent. So yeah, hugely important. And then in the intervening year after a fire, it's like the best time to see flytrap habitat. There's so many things flowering that are thriving with that new amount of light. So it's really wonderful.
Yes, I bet. Well, talking about going in and seeing them, are they something that, like someone like me who has never seen a Venus flytrap in the wild before, if I walk through an area where they were at, would I see them? Would I actually spot them and recognize them? Maybe if they weren't flowering, so I didn't have those big white flowers to say, oh, what's that? And catch my eye. Would I notice them, or would they just kind of blend in with the habitat?
That's a good question. Because it depends. Most of the time, I'd say if they're not flowering, you'll probably walk right by them because there are a bunch of co-occurring grasses. Wiregrass specifically is a big one that sort of, at least from a bird's eye view, are covering up those traps. And it's a smallish plant. It's smaller than the palm of your hand, and the seedlings are about the size of a quarter. So they're easy to walk by. Sometimes they occur, out in the open, co-occurring with sphagnum moss, very, very out in the open. There are places that are public about the fact that they have Venus flytrap on their lands and encourage people to go see them. So an example I usually give, if you're in the Wilmington area, is the Stanley Reeder Garden. They have places where you can see native carnivorous plants and will have signs pointing you right to them so you won't miss them. So that's a chance to see Venus flytraps in a site that is analogous to what it would look like in the wild.
Yeah, the reason I asked was because I found I was shown, I didn't find it. I was shown my first sundews in the wild ever not too long ago. And yeah, I never would have noticed them.
Sundews are like sundew. I've forgotten the common names for our two tiny sundews, but there's brevifolia and the other one. They're tiny. They're like someone dropped a bunch of dimes on the ground, smaller even. So yeah, they're easy to pass by. Venus flytraps, a little bit bigger than sundews. If they're in the open and you're looking at your feet, you might see them. So if you find yourself in the right habitat and you're looking around, yeah, it's possible you see them. If you're in the Wilmington area and you go to the Stanley Reeder Garden, I really recommend going in late May to early June, because that's when you'll see them flowering. Some of the sundews are flowering around that time too, so it's a really cool time to see them.
Might have to plan a trip. But you were talking about how rare they are and how there was only, what'd you say, 69 populations?
Yeah, about that, about 69 to 72, somewhere around that range.
Somewhere there. How certain are we that we have found all the populations, or could there be others that we just haven't identified yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to say anything with any certainty. Like, of the giant populations, I feel like we found those. But, of those 70 some odd populations, most of them, as I mentioned, are small. They're tiny. Some of them are on private land in people's backyards. Some of them are occurring next to roads in just regular suburban neighborhoods. So there's this ongoing effort to have people who live in the area, if they're living on suitable habitat, to look in their yards and see if they have Venus flytraps, and if they feel comfortable reporting that to an appropriate agency so that we can get an idea of the full population size of Venus flytrap and how well it's doing. Each of those little subpopulations matters a whole lot for a rare species. So Natural Heritage Program is usually the place to report that. Yeah, and it's just a cool thing to have in your yard.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. So that'd be just an amazing thing to find in your yard, and to have the opportunity to find something like that, and then to be a caregiver for that little small population.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can understand maybe people, if they find this rare and scientifically interesting plant in their yard, they might not want people coming to go check it out or look at it. And I understand that. What I'm quick to tell homeowners is that we can't tell you anything about how to manage your property. Plants are outside that sort of jurisdiction. So what you do with your property is up to you. And you might find some satisfaction in being the keeper of this very special plant in your own yard. So yeah, if you're in the Wilmington area or within 100 miles and you live in the Intercoastal Plain, just have a look. Have a look. It's always worth it.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, people have bog gardens in their yards. I mean, people will put them in sometimes. So yeah, just have your own little natural one. You don't even have to go buy the plants. You've got it right there, possibly. Yeah. So there's positives to this too. And bog gardening is a whole nother topic for another podcast potentially. But
yes. Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, this was something that would just fit in very naturally. You've already got the habitat. And a lot of times that's what I talk to people about when they're asking me about what can I plant here, or how do I do this, or I'm doing some of the consulting work that I do. I mean, we want to start with getting to know what you've got to begin with and what that area would have been. And then let's work with the stories and the plants that you have there and build from there, not try and make it something that it isn't.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that mindset. And it would just, if you have a spot in your yard that's wet and sitting in water and being beaten by the sunshine all the time, then plants that like having their feet wet we got plenty of them here at the East Coast of Well, wherever you are, but East Coast of North Carolina for sure. We have some really special plants that would really love that environment. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. This has been very interesting and educational. So thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to talk with you.
Yes. And if people have questions and want to learn more, where would you suggest they go?
So I think I suggested for the show notes a Venus Flytrap Champions website. It's a work in progress, but it's a multi-agency effort to give people who have fly traps on their land resources to learn more about those plants and potentially to manage those habitats. And also, people are welcome to shoot me an email if they have any questions. I love talking forever and ever and ever about bugs and plants. So, yeah, shoot me a message.
Okay, sounds great. And I can put your email in the show notes as well then.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon.
Yeah. And yeah, thanks again and have a great day.
Same to you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. I really appreciate Laurie taking the time to talk with us. I learned a lot about Venus flytraps while preparing for this conversation and while talking with her. I hope you enjoyed the conversations and learned a lot too. And if you live in the right area, then I highly encourage you to look in your own yard, along the local roads, etc., and report any Venus flytrap populations that you might find. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to remind you of the Backyard Ecology YouTube channel. Please take a moment to check it out, and while you are there, don't forget to like the videos, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.